This episode contains mature themes. AI technology is used to enhance the listening experience. Listener discretion is advised. In the early hours before dawn, ranchers across the American West step into fields they've walked their whole lives, only to find something waiting in the grass that shouldn't be there. A healthy cow lies dead, perfectly intact, except for the impossible. Precise cuts with no blood, organs removed with surgical accuracy, and no tracks, no struggle, no sign of what approached it in the night. For decades, officials have searched for answers. Locals have searched for patterns. But whatever moves out there leaves only one truth behind. And whatever it isn't finished. Welcome to Three Theories, the podcast where we uncover the great mysteries of the world. I'm Elena Hart, your guide on this journey through the unknown. Each episode will examine unsolved cases, paranormal phenomena, and historical and natural mysteries, and explore three compelling theories to help you decide, what do you believe? The phenomenon began quietly, almost privately, on isolated stretches of ranch land where silence spans for miles and wind replaces conversation. These were places where the nights felt heavier than they should, and the nearest neighbor might be a half-hour's drive away. It was the mid-1960s when the first reports surfaced. A handful of cattle found dead under unusual circumstances. At first, ranchers chalked it up to predators or disease. Animals die. It's part of ranch life. But the details didn't line up. And the ranchers who discovered the bodies knew it the moment they stepped close enough to see the wounds. Something about the scenes felt wrong, in a way that didn't fit the rhythms of land and livestock they'd known their whole lives. The scenes were unnervingly similar. The flesh around the jawline removed in a perfect circle, as if measured. Eyes taken cleanly with no tearing. Tongues excised deep from the throat, requiring far more precision than any wild animal could manage. These weren't messy kills. They weren't chaotic. They were clinical. Some ranchers swore the edges of the cuts looked too straight, too intentional, as though whoever, or whatever, made them understood anatomy far better than any predator stalking open plains. Law enforcement would sometimes arrive to find a carcass so devoid of blood it appeared drained entirely, not pooled on the ground, not soaked into the soil, simply absent. The deputies who came out on those early calls were used to the rough, unpolished reality of livestock deaths, but even they recognized how far these scenes drifted from the norm. In some cases, the incisions looked cauterized, as though heat had sealed them instantly. Deputies would crouch down, touch the edges, and pull their fingers back with a slow, unsettled confusion that never made it into the official reports. What they wrote, and what they privately admitted, were two very different things. One rancher from Colorado recalled walking toward a fallen cow just after sunrise, the grass still wet beneath his boots. He noticed how still everything felt, the kind of stillness that doesn't belong on open land. No birds, no insects, just a heavy, waiting quiet. He remembered thinking he should hear something, the low call of cattle somewhere in the distance, the rustle of morning wind across the pasture. But instead, he heard only his own breathing. As he approached the carcass, he felt something else, a faint metallic smell. Not blood, but sharp, like heated machinery or an electrical current lingering in the air. When he reached the animal, he saw the same signs that would soon define a national mystery. The missing organs, the bloodless skin, the precision-cut hide around the jaw. "It looked like something had been here," he said later, "but whatever it was, didn't walk." And he meant it literally. No prints circled the animal. The soil hadn't been disturbed. Nothing had dragged or chased it. It was as though the cow had been placed there, altered, and left behind. These early accounts spread not through newspapers, but through whispers between ranchers who didn't want to sound paranoid. They'd talk about it quietly over coffee at the feed store or after church, lowering their voices when someone unfamiliar walked in. Yet the pattern grew, following no clear logic. Montana, Utah, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma. The mutilations didn't cluster in one place for long. They surfaced like strikes, unexpected and precise, disappearing for months before happening again hundreds of miles away. Ranchers who had never met described nearly identical scenes. By the 1970s, the incidents had escalated enough that law enforcement and federal agencies took notice. The FBI launched an investigation in 1979, focusing especially on cases in New Mexico, where ranchers reported dozens of mutilations over a short period. Agents studied the wounds, interviewed veterinarians, and documented environmental conditions. Their final report offered no definitive explanation. What they said publicly lacked the urgency ranchers had been feeling for years. Between the lines, the frustration was clear. The agents weren't dealing with sporadic oddities. They were chasing something consistent, patterned, and unnervingly controlled. Investigators walked fields where even their own footprints stood out starkly in the soil. Then they'd turn to the carcass and see nothing. No tracks, no drag marks, no blood. Some mutilations occurred in areas where there were no footprints, not from humans, not from predators, not even from the cow itself, despite appearing to have fallen where it died. In a few cases, ranchers insisted the animals had been alive the night before, only to be found hours later with organs removed that would have required time, tools, and expertise. The speed of the event disturbed investigators almost as much as the precision. One rancher in Oregon described the unsettling sense that the mutilation had happened quickly, far more quickly than seemed possible. He'd passed the same field twice in one night while checking fences. The cow was alive at dusk, grazing. It was dead by dawn, but the body was still warm when he found it. Even stranger, dew clung to the grass everywhere except the ground immediately around the carcass, as if something had displaced or evaporated it. He noticed the soil felt slightly warmer too. Not hot, but warmer than the surrounding ground, as though it had briefly been exposed to a heat source. Veterinarians who examined these animals struggled to reconcile the observations. Some described cuts too clean for scavengers. Others noted the lack of blood and the odd absence of signs of predation. In a handful of cases, the reproductive organs were removed, though the cuts lacked the jagged edges typical of wildlife activity. A few vets noticed something else. The tissue beneath the wounds sometimes appeared pale or rubbery, as if exposed to extreme cold or heat immediately before removal. Over time, the phenomenon became part of rural folklore, a quiet dread that settled into communities dependent on their livestock. The mutilations weren't constant, but they were persistent, enough to create unease whenever ranchers walked their property alone at night. Some ranchers started carrying firearms everywhere, not out of confidence, but out of unease. Others began leaving powerful floodlights on through the night, illuminating entire pastures just in case something returned. It wasn't the sight of the animals that frightened them most. It was the feeling that something was crossing their land without being seen, choosing its targets without making a sound. And as the years passed, the question only grew darker. If these weren't random acts of nature, then what exactly was happening out there? The most widely accepted explanation, at least by authorities, is that the mutilations can be attributed to natural causes. The logic is straightforward. Cattle die frequently from disease, injury, or environmental stress, and scavengers are opportunistic. Animals such as coyotes, foxes, and birds often target the softest tissues first: the eyes, tongue, and reproductive organs. When they feed, their teeth and beaks can leave marks that look deceptively sharp, especially to a distressed rancher stumbling upon the scene. Officials often lean on this reasoning because it fits neatly into the familiar rhythms of the natural world, offering a grounded and non-threatening answer in situations where fear tends to spread quickly. There's also the phenomenon of post-mortem bloat. When a cow dies, internal gases build up, stretching the hide until it splits. These tears can appear linear and clean-cut, especially on fresh carcasses. Combined with decomposition and insect activity, the body can quickly take on a disturbing appearance, one that mimics surgical precision. Researchers who've studied the effects of early-stage decomposition note that in the right conditions, a carcass can transform drastically in only a few hours, changing from ordinary livestock death to something that appears deliberate and almost methodical. Some veterinarians have emphasized this point over the years, explaining that what ranchers perceive as bloodless is often a natural result of gravity and pooling. Blood drains internally or into the soil, and scavengers can remove flesh without leaving a mess behind. In open fields, environmental conditions like heat and dry winds can desiccate wounds quickly, creating a crisp edge that resembles cauterization. Under this interpretation, the frightening details are simply the byproduct of nature working its course before anyone arrives to see it. On paper, it makes sense, and for many cases, it may very well be true. Plenty of carcasses display irregular wounds that, once studied closely, fall well within the range of normal wildlife activity, and authorities, pressed for explanations, typically lean on these biological processes because they provide closure, or at least the closest thing to closure available. Yet thousands of reports over the decades contain details that resist this explanation. Ranchers describe carcasses that appear drained of blood entirely, not pooled beneath them or soaked into the earth. They describe incisions so exact that even veterinarians hesitate. They describe the complete absence of tracks around the body, not just predator tracks, but the cow's own final movements. These are observations made not once or twice, but repeatedly, across states, across decades, across different climates and conditions. Even the FBI's 1979 investigation, which leaned heavily toward natural explanations, quietly acknowledged inconsistencies. In private notes, some agents mentioned cases that didn't fit neatly within the framework of scavenging. A few were troubled by accounts of missing organs removed with what appeared to be deliberate technique. Field agents reportedly returned from some sites uneasy, struck by details they couldn't articulate fully in their official summaries. But the official conclusion leaned away from mystery. Publicly, the Bureau emphasized that 95% of cases could be explained by predators and decomposition. The remaining 5%, they didn't elaborate on. And to the ranchers living through the phenomenon, that silence was louder than any answer. If authorities were confident, why leave room for doubt? Why acknowledge an unexplained remainder at all? For ranchers, that gap is where the unease still lives. If the majority of cases can be explained, what about the others? What about the perfectly circular cuts? What about the organs removed without damage to surrounding tissue? What about the nights when no tracks appear and no predators are seen? The questions hang heavy, resurfacing every time another carcass is found with the same impossible signs. Something in the data doesn't sit cleanly within the boundaries of nature. Something slips through the cracks of official explanations, defying the reliability of predators, decomposition, and chance. And as long as that small percentage remains unexplained, the suspicion lingers that a larger truth might be slipping past unnoticed. And if natural causes fall short, then something else must be at work. The second theory shifts the focus from predators to people, specifically people who operate in the margins of government work, scientific research, or covert operations. According to this explanation, cattle mutilations may be the result of intentional human intervention, carried out quietly and systematically across remote regions where few would witness it. In this view, the phenomenon isn't an accident of nature, but a coordinated effort designed to unfold in places where silence stretches for miles and prying eyes are rare. This theory gained traction in the 1970s and 1980s, when suspicions about military experiments ran high. Some ranchers near military bases reported helicopters flying low over their land days or even hours before mutilations occurred. Witnesses described silent black aircraft, sometimes without lights, hovering over pastures long after midnight. Others claimed to find unusual tire tracks near their property, or odd indentations in the soil that looked like landing gear. The sightings were scattered, but their consistency left many wondering whether someone, or something, was surveilling their livestock long before any mutilation took place. Under this framework, cattle aren't being mutilated, they're being harvested. Organs are collected for testing, whether for monitoring disease, studying environmental toxins, or evaluating the effects of biological agents. The secrecy would be necessary to avoid public panic, legal complications, or ethical backlash. If the work involved experimental pathogens or classified environmental programs, then plausible deniability would be as critical as the research itself. The cattle, in this interpretation, are simply the most abundant and accessible biological markers on the American landscape. There are small hints that lend this theory weight. During the height of fears around anthrax and brucellosis, cattle were indeed subjects of study. The military has a long history of environmental monitoring in rural areas, and certain organs commonly removed in mutilations, reproductive tissue, lymph nodes, tongues, can indicate exposure to contaminants or infectious agents. To some investigators, the pattern of removed organs doesn't look random, it looks chosen. It looks like someone following a list. Still, there's no public documentation connecting any official program to the phenomenon, and federal agencies consistently deny involvement. When pressed, they point to the same explanations as Theory 1: scavengers, decomposition, and misunderstanding. The denials are unwavering, and the official statements always circle back to nature, even when ranchers insist that what they witnessed feels anything but natural. But ranchers who've lost livestock push back. They argue that anyone harvesting organs would need surgical precision and advanced equipment, something seen in many unexplained cases. They recall the feeling of being watched after reporting mutilations. They describe the eerie, low hum of aircraft that shouldn't be flying at night. They mention how quickly the carcasses appear, how cleanly they are altered, and how the mutilations sometimes occur in clusters, as though following a schedule. For them, the idea of coincidence stretches thin. Even then, doubts remain. Why use cattle? Why now? And why leave the bodies behind in such a conspicuous state? If the goal were secrecy, wouldn't the carcasses be removed entirely? Dragging a mutilated animal away would be easier than explaining why one was left in perfect view, yet the bodies are always right where they dropped, or where they were placed. Supporters of this theory point to one unsettling possibility. The bodies are left intentionally, whether as markers, warnings, or evidence meant only for those conducting the work. The message is unclear. But for ranchers who see helicopters before mutilations and silence afterward, the idea of human involvement feels less like speculation and more like a shadow crossing their land. It becomes less about theory and more about instinct, that cold, prickling awareness that someone has been where they shouldn't, doing something they won't explain. Yet even this theory fails to account for the strangest details: the lack of tracks, the absence of blood, the precise circular cuts that seem beyond field surgery. These anomalies slip out of reach, even for the most elaborate human-centered explanations. And if people aren't responsible and natural causes fall short, something else might be moving in the dark. The final theory is the one many whisper about, but few say aloud: that the mutilations are the result of non-human intelligence. Whether extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or something older rooted in the landscape itself, this explanation steps beyond conventional science, yet strangely fits the evidence that the other theories struggle to explain. It's the theory that lingers at the edges of conversation, surfacing only when the sun goes down, when the land grows quiet, and when people feel braver speaking about things they can't fully name. Reports stretching back to the earliest cases include lights in the sky, strange humming noises, animals reacting in fear hours before mutilations occur, and scenes showing no tracks, as though the cows were taken, altered, and returned silently. Some ranchers describe bright, pulsing orbs drifting over pastures, moving with an intelligence that doesn't match aircraft. Others talk about beams of light scanning fields, or shadows that don't seem to belong to anything physical. A few even mention the unsettling sensation of being watched by something vast and deliberate, long before any mutilation is discovered. The surgical precision seen in the wounds, the removal of organs without damaging surrounding tissue, the cauterized edges, the bloodless cuts, all align with technology beyond human capability, at least publicly. The absences are just as telling: no tire tracks, no helicopter noise, no footprints. The land remains undisturbed except for the cow itself, as though whatever conducted the procedure did not need to touch the ground. It's the kind of scene that leaves investigators standing in open fields, staring upward despite themselves. Veterinarians examining these cases sometimes describe an uncanny sensation, a sense that the tissue damage doesn't match any known instrument. Some wounds appear too clean. Others look as though the flesh was removed in a single motion, as if lifted out rather than cut away. And many carcasses show signs of heat without signs of burning, as though the tissue was altered by something far more controlled than flame. Even the seasoned professionals, the ones used to trauma and animal death, have admitted privately that they cannot explain what they're looking at. Even more unsettling, the organs taken are consistent across decades and states. Reproductive organs, tongues, hearts, eyes, areas rich in genetic, hormonal, or nutritional information. The pattern never drifts, it never experiments, it simply repeats, with the kind of steadiness that suggests a mission rather than chaos. If one assumes another intelligence is responsible, the pattern becomes chillingly methodical. The mutilations begin to look less like isolated events and more like data collection, or ongoing study, or monitoring. something systematic and patient, moving through the landscape year after year. For supporters of this theory, the lack of evidence isn't a problem. It's exactly what they expect. Whatever is behind the mutilations is either advanced enough to avoid detection or simply unconcerned by human observation. The silence becomes its calling card. The emptiness of the scene becomes its signature. To skeptics, the theory sounds far-fetched. And yet, the alternative explanations leave gaps that grow larger the deeper investigators look. The phenomenon doesn't behave like natural predation. It doesn't act like human experimentation. It moves with purpose, precision, and an eerie disregard for being witnessed. Ranchers describe a feeling, a wrongness hanging in the air on nights before they find a carcass. Some say the cattle themselves sense it, gathering close, moving strangely, refusing to cross parts of the pasture. Others admit that they avoid certain fields after dark, not because of predators, but because something in their instincts tells them they are not alone. Something is choosing, taking, and returning these animals. And whatever it is, it hasn't stopped. Thank you for joining us on this episode of 3 Theories. The mystery of cattle mutilations remains one of the most disturbing and persistent enigmas in rural America. Are these animals victims of natural processes, misunderstood but ultimately explainable? Are they targeted in secret operations hidden from the public eye? Or is something else tracking them under open skies? Something not bound by our understanding of life on this planet. What do you believe? Visit 3theoriespodcast.com for resources, documents, and additional reading to help you form your own conclusions. Share your thoughts with us on social media and join the conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Join us next time as we investigate another haunting case and present 3 more theories for you to consider. Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction.